So what will active listening reveal today? I'm Martha Schumacher, and I'm glad you asked. Thanks for taking the time to join us. At the end of our last episode, the action item I proposed was to take a look at your own organization and ask yourself the question, is your organization co-creating the future that your mission recipients actually want? And if the answer is no, what are possible ways you can approach your organization's leaders and ask this question in the meantime? This question was presented by Amiki Carol Akawumi, our exceptional, generous guest last time. Thanks to those of you who have reached out to let me know how this went. I hope that the rest of you have found it helpful in your professional life too. And if that answer was no, and you considered approaching your organization's leader, what was their response? As we'll talk about a lot in this episode, not every leader has all the answers, and not every leadership structure is perfect for each organization. Regardless of whether your leader is always effective, and no doubt they aren't, because come on, we're all human, right? But one of the most important aspects of active listening is to withhold judgment. It's so easy to be frustrated with professional and personal relationships, especially when the power dynamics are uneven. When asking the right questions, it's so vital to put aside these frustrations and express empathy. And yes, I know that can be very hard. Believe me, I have been there. But here's why it's so important. Remaining neutral and non-judgmental as you have these conversations enables the other person to feel comfortable sharing their thoughts. It creates a safe zone, further establishing trust. People are much more solution-oriented when they don't feel that they'll be shamed, blamed, or criticized. It's not always easy, but recognizing judgmental thoughts and pushing them aside during these conversations is essential. I'd also like to touch on another active listening technique, one that I talked about last week, and that's about creating a comfortable environment when preparing to have a conversation. I'm bringing this back up because of today's guest, Vu Le, and his remarkable ability to embrace comfort in uncomfortable moments. To set the stage for our upcoming conversation, Vu takes the call from a futon with his laptop resting in his lap while wearing blue headphones that he borrowed from his daughter. So often, we feel the need to present the way we were programmed, in other words, looking quote-unquote corporate. For many people, that can detract from their true personality. I know it does for me when I've tried to do that over the years. When people feel the need to pretend to be more formal than they usually are, it can be a distraction, keeping them from acting naturally. By presenting a comfortable version of ourselves, we can encourage our conversation partner to also feel more comfortable, be more vulnerable, and build that pivotal trust. You'll hear the many ways that Vu brings comfort and positivity into his interactions. This brings us to our questions today. Vu starts us off with a doozy. What brings you joy? This question cuts through all the noise and reaches directly into building empathy. Just wait until you hear how Vu utilizes it in his work. The second question is from me. It's a question that you can ask anyone, although I am laser focused on asking your staff this crucial prompt. The question is, what can I do to help make your experience here better? Our conversation focuses on different styles of leadership and how they all require honest communication and, again, empathy. As Vu rightly points out, ensuring that you've created an environment where folks feel safe answering this prompt is extremely important. Our third and final question is from a recent guest and good friend, Charing Koshi, who asks Vu directly, if you were in-house today, which leadership model would you want to be a part of and why? I love how Vu unpacks this question, and I think you will too. You'll note that Charing added "and why," which, as we've explored on other episodes, helps you have a more meaningful, in-depth discussion. Now, without further ado, let's dive into episode 4 of Glad You Asked. Welcome to Glad You Asked, a show about how active listening can help you build stronger connections with folks in your life, personally and professionally. I'm Martha Schumacher, and I've spent my career asking leaders, funders, donors, and community members thoughtful questions to help find the real reasons behind why they do what they do. And when you pursue these deeper connections, you ultimately arrive at the heart of what really matters, establishing trust. On each episode of Glad You Asked, we'll explore 3 questions, one from our guest, one from a listener, and one from me. During a conversation with mission-driven leaders, we'll test how each question, each compelling prompt, makes active listening possible and deepens our relationships. Afterwards, we'll take a look at how effective our questions were in guiding a meaningful conversation and leave you with a call to action so you can use these questions in your own work and life. Now, let's meet our guest. Okay, folks, so a force of nature and one of the most prolific, dynamic, he's going to start squirming because I'm just throwing all of this out at him right now, and unapologetic voices of the social impact sector. Vu Le has been an executive director twice. He's launched a wildly popular blog at NonprofitAF.com, co-founded the community-centric fundraising movement, and recently authored his first book, which is called Reimagining Nonprofits and Philanthropy, Unlocking the Full Potential of a Vital and Complex Sector. Stay tuned, by the way, to get a copy of this book gratis, folks. We'll talk about that later. Vu, welcome to Glad You Asked.
Hi, Martha. Thank you for having me. I popped in a piece of chocolate into my mouth right when you were doing the intro. I was trying not to chew too loudly.
It's all good. You do you. This is supposed to be a comfortable setting, I hope. Before we kind of dive into our questions today in this active listening framework that we're creating, I know that there's not per se a, lofty official book tour going on, but for example, anything kind of interesting or fun or funny that you've picked up from folks in terms of interacting with them around the book?
Well, I've been just really appreciative of everyone who's been reading the book. My publisher tells me it's been doing pretty well. So yeah, it's been great. I've been traveling around just talking about the book. But I think the best thing is my 9-year-old started reading the book, and I asked him what his opinion of it was, and he said, "It's not as boring as I thought it would be." So I think that's pretty high praise from a 9-year-old.
That, testimonials aside, right? Forget that. That is the biggest praise you could get, right?
Yeah. How are you doing?
How am I doing? You're asking
Yeah.
me. I'm doing well. I am doing well while also being daily, hourly, minute by minute concerned about the state of our world. But I'm also trying to keep hope alive. And I think one of the things I appreciate most about you that you did a recent post on here's the good news, not just in the States, but around the world. So that gave me a lot of hope. Right now I feel like it's kind of a constant balance of keeping the hope alive while keeping eyes wide open to what's happening. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I feel you. I think the news cycles make us feel like there's just endlessly bad news all the time. And there's a lot of horrible things happening all over. And at the same time, there's some really amazing things happening too. Like the ozone layer is healing. And Namibia is basically all women run in terms of their government. And Burkina Faso has been having tremendous success with their Great Green Wall project to stop desertification. So, and then we have this just wave of amazing leaders, progressive leaders being elected everywhere. So, I think we need to maintain hope.
I agree, and I love all of those examples. And thanks for asking me about me. I appreciate that very much.
Well, I needed time to chew on the rest of my chocolate.
You needed me to vamp a little, right, as they say, right, while you were chewing. So I loved my exchange with you before this show around what question, because the question you landed on, and of course we talked about more than one, is
Yeah, the question we land on is, well, what's bringing you joy right now? What's I mean, we talked about some other ones, like what are you ready to burn down?
Yes,
But like,
yes.
so I kind of teeter between those two, which is there are lots of things we need to think about burning down. At the same time, I do think with everything being so stressful that it's really important to ground ourselves in joy and hope and even little things, like it was like a really good fall over here in Seattle. Like this is probably the most amazing fall in terms of colors that I've seen. So I've been driving around just taking pictures. I think one day I just drove around all day. Instead of doing work, I just drove around, and there's just some beautiful trees.
But that is work. Like, that's good work, right? That's self-care.
Yeah, so yeah, with icebreakers and things, it's kind of important to kind of ground people in what is one thing. It could be a very small thing that is bringing you joy to your day and helps you keep going.
Like chocolate.
Yes, chocolate is a very important thing to me. You know, it does not bring me joy to get kidney stones, which apparently it kind of contributes to.
No.
It's okay. I'll risk kidney stones for chocolate. So
You and me both, my friend. So, what does bring you joy? I mean, I think you've just shared a couple. Chocolate's a theme, but also getting out in nature. Are there other things you want to share that bring you joy during this very turbulent time?
yeah, there's tons. I really like some of the shows that I've been watching. I watched Dairy Girls. I've been rewatching Schitt's
So
Creek.
good.
Dairy Girl is so funny.
Dairy Girls is hilarious.
I mean, you
Hilarious.
have to turn on the captions to understand what's going on, but
Yes.
because they speak in
Yes.
very heavy Irish accents, and but they're hilarious. Schitt's Creek is good. I've been rewatching
Uh,
that. I found a
so
show
great.
called North of North, which is about an Inuit community, an Inuit woman and her mom, and they're very messy. And I find so much joy in people on the margins, people of color, or just being themselves and not having to think about injustice. Like I think we deserve to be messy too,
Love that.
And I really love shows that just show people as human beings instead of just always focusing on like the injustice against us.
I think it's really important because this whole idea of every person being able to be represented as a whole person, right? Not
Yeah.
as this stereotype or that piece of who they are, but an entire, whole person.
Oh, absolutely. We deserve to be messy, and I don't know, some of us are assholes, and we deserve to have the full facet, the full complexity of human existence here. So I
There you
love
go.
shows like Insecure or One Day at a Time, Kim's Convenience. It just shows people just living.
Yeah.
Maybe sometimes, yeah, it talks about like racism or sexism or things that they're dealing with, but most of the time they're just living their lives.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important, especially now with everything going on with the anti-immigrant sentiments and backlash and things. I think it's easy to dehumanize people, or sometimes well-meaning people will kind of place us into like these different scenarios where whether it's idealized versions of us or things, and that is in a way dehumanizing too. So I really like the representation of just people being their full self.
So, what do you think about this joy question kind of putting it out into the world? Are you at, like, when you're out and about right now, are you asking a lot of people that question?
I do. Sometimes I lead meetings and there's an icebreaking question, or sometimes I'm on a webinar or I'm giving a speech and virtually, it's a good question to put into the chat box, right? And ask people to
Mm,
contribute, like where are you from, and what's one thing that's bringing you joy recently.
I like that.
And people will list all sorts of things, and then people start getting really happy because they're like, oh, like I think it triggers something in the brain when everyone starts talking about the things that are making them joyful, and then it rewires everyone to kind of like it shifts the vibe a bit. That doesn't mean that we stay there. We still have to address some very difficult things in the world, but I think that shift allows us to kind of envision what it is, and remember what it is that we're fighting for.
And the thing I particularly like about this, and it's part of why I wanted the format for this show to be about questions, is the language you use, right? Literally every word and how you put those words together. Like the idea that you're asking the question, what's bringing you joy versus, for example, do you have any joy in your life? When you said it about, reframing people's brains, I feel like the way you ask that question helps to reframe folks, especially if folks are coming on your webinar or coming to a presentation, whatever, and they're really struggling, right?
Yeah. Well, what's bringing you joy, Martha?
You brought up nature. I mean, for me, that's often my number one, which is to get out hiking. And then I think also my dogs. My dogs give me a lot of joy on a daily basis. In fact, before we got on this show, I almost ended up having one of my dogs in the room with me and then realized, boy, this is going to be the moment when he barks, so I didn't do it. But, just animals, being animals and, just kind of being there for you and excited when they see you is nice.
Well,
so
I don't know. Maybe you should bring your dogs next time.
there you go. I
I
like
feel
it.
like we tend to focus on certain things. Like this is the way to be professional, right? And I don't know, having the occasional dog bark can help to kind of jostle people out of this sort of mentality of like the separation. Like there's no more separation of work and life and everything. Everything is it's just us. We need to be able to be fully human too.
I really agree with that. I hope I'm getting better and better at that personally and better at encouraging others to do that. So I really appreciate that reminder because I think part of that mindset's also kind of the corporate, like corporate perfection mode or stance. And I'm doing everything I can to kind of not, be in that mode because I think it's not helpful and often damaging. So I'm with you. I like, authenticity, I think, right, is what we're talking about. So let's move into the second question. What can I do to help make your experience at fill in the blank NGO good or better? And of course, in general, I'm really talking about staff. There are other people, that you could be asking. You could be asking that question of board members, for example. But I'm really on that question pretty focused on staff. And I'm wondering when you were in those roles, if you, asked those, and I'm kind of guessing with your style, you probably did. But just to hear about your response to that question and if how it resonates with you.
Yeah. To be honest, if I'm gonna be honest, I was very bad at asking that
Ah,
question. Okay.
okay.
Um, but anyway, I knew my weakness, and hired a managing director, an amazing person named Ananda Valenzuela, and they came in and was really good at asking those types of questions. And I know they ask that
Nice.
question all the time. And it really helped to transform our organization because a lot of the things that the staff were asking for, like it was very simple things. Like, can we get a better microwave or, can we keep this kitchen cleaner? But if once you get enough in there, like a trust built, then I think we were able to dive into things that were more meaningful, including things like, maybe our decision making process needs to be changed. Maybe there is too much power concentrated in certain positions and not enough where it should be. Right. And I think
Sure.
those types of questions helped us to start exploring things such as more shared leadership, distributed decision
Yes.
making models, which I talk about in my book.
Yes. Well, two things. First of all, yay, Ananda, for being that person for you, and what a great partnership. And then, secondly, it sounds like what I'm hearing is that Ananda was open enough to that then also that opened the floodgates around people feeling safe, which to me is the key to that question, right? Is to be able to create an environment in the workplace where people feel safe giving honest answers to that question. And by doing that, I think, tell me if I'm off here. I think what you're saying is by doing that, then people felt safe saying, well, there are some actually major systemic issues we should, be addressing. Is that fair?
Absolutely. That's a great summary of it. Sometimes people ask this question, and I'm not so sure. I feel like sometimes if it's not done right, it could feel like a very rote, you check the box kind of
Sure.
question. It's like, what
Sure.
can do we do to make, but then you don't actually want to change anything. In
Yes.
which case, then it just feels like it feels
Performative, right?
yeah, it
Sorry to
feels
interrupt, but
that's
yeah.
no, that's the perfect word for it.
Yeah.
And a lot of bosses can be very performative, and they find different tools of performance, including some of these well-meaning questions. I think they can be very
Yes.
powerful, but I appreciate what you're saying about like active listening. Like if you're not actively listening, if you're not, and that includes, I think for me, the willingness to change and to follow through on what someone asks. Like if
Yes.
you're not ready to implement what someone or seriously consider and implement what someone is going, like why ask them? We've been seeing this in a lot of community organizing and community like listening sessions, for example, which a lot of communities and people are just very tired of.
Sure.
Funders going to communities
Yeah.
and asking them like, what should we do? What can we do better? And then nonprofit leaders say things like, well, we need more general operating funds. We need you to give more money, or we need you to support advocacy and community
Yeah.
organizing. And then the funders are like, okay, that sounds great. That does not align with our strategies or our agenda this year. So then what was the point of that?
But thanks for your input.
Right, exactly. We did a great job. Look, everyone. We listened to you. We had a great listening session.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
sometimes it just feels even worse than to just not do it at all because it's insulting and paternalistic. And I think going back to
Yeah.
like the staff, if you're a boss who is not willing to actually to seriously consider the feedback that you get, then be careful about like these types of questions because they can build a lot of resentment.
Wow. Yes. And I think you just this is literally an aha moment for me from this standpoint, Vu. I think what I really want to make sure we're all doing when we talk about active listening is emphasizing the active and active listening, right? In other words, listening and then taking real action on what you heard. And I've just never quite kind of talked about it that way, right? To me, active listening does need to be active, but perhaps the most important action, right, is then, okay, you've heard this. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. All right. Anything else on that?
Yeah. Yeah. I have lots to say about everything. I'm very opinionated.
No, you're shy. You're very shy.
Right. We do have to consider the sort of like all the dynamics around race and gender and intersectionality when we have these questions. What I find is that people who are from marginalized communities, we have been so used to being neglected and ignored or assessed. We have to assess the risk of being honest. When you ask this question, someone who is used to and have the privilege, white colleagues, male colleagues, neurotypical people will be able to maybe more likely to be honest and say, hey, yeah, I would love a few more days off, right? Or whatever. Can we like take all the Fridays off during the summer, right? Or
Yes.
whatever it is.
Yes.
But someone who's from a marginalized community may be terrified and they may not even realize that they're anxious about being honest because in the past they might have been punished for trusting that this person actually means and is genuinely curious about what would actually make their experience better. And so when you are getting ready to ask this type of question, just be thoughtful about your own privilege as well as the dynamics regarding who you're speaking with and what they may have experienced because of like systemic injustice.
Yes. So our third question came from a listener, and his name is Charian Koshi. And this is first for you, Vu, specifically, but then we're going to kind of fan it out. But the question from Cherian for you is, in your new book, you talk about various options for breaking the traditional one-person CEO/ED leadership mold. If you were in-house today, which model of all the models that you laid out in the book do you think you would want to be a part of, and why?
Yeah. Well, going back to what I had talked about earlier, which is when we brought in Ananda into the organization, we had been very top down traditional model with me as the ED at the top. It was not working as well for me and for the rest of the team. That is not to say, and this is something that Ananda would say, which is like it's not a binary. It's not like top down is bad and flatter structures are good always, right?
Right.
She always cautions that there's some advantages and disadvantages of either one. For me, though, I think I do prefer sort of the flatter structures. I think that it has been very challenging for leaders, and may explain why so many leaders burn out. Is because in traditional models, it's because there's just so much weight put on the shoulders of the person who is at the top. And it is lonely, it is frustrating, everyone blames you. Most of the time, everyone hates you. I mean, like, right? Maybe it was just me. I don't know. It was rough. And I was an ED of 2 organizations, and it was always very stressful. And I talked to other EDs and who are in traditional models, and it has been stressful. When we brought in Ananda, I think that was when I realized, look, this sort of traditional model does not really work very well for me, because there's certain things I'm just not good at. Like I'm actually not good at staff supervision. I mean, I like talking to people, I like working with people, but more on a equal basis, Whereas if
Sure.
you are sort of the supervisor, you're kind of expected to play a certain role, and there's power dynamics involved.
Indeed.
There's a lot of coaching involved. If you're a good supervisor, you also have to be a good coach. And I realize I'm sometimes not the best coach because I'm very impatient, right? And coach is like, what do you think should be the solution to this problem? And I'm like, no, just do this.
Right.
Yeah. And so, yeah, for me, I think that the sort of shared leadership and flatter structures resonates more with me.
Yeah, and you lay out a number of great examples of that in the book. I loved that section, and I really recommend folks listening read very closely the section on the many options. That's what we should be moving towards for the future, is more and more organizations at a minimum having co-leaders, but I think, even flatter, to your point. Is that a question you've asked others?
Yeah. Well, with this book, I've been talking to folks about basically reimagining everything in the sector.
Sure.
Right. There's definitely the CEO, ED sort of dynamics with staff, but also board relationships with CEOs and EDs. And we need to reimagine and rethink that too. Like, so many boards are really ineffective, if not destructive to their missions. And we need to start thinking, well, maybe we don't have to do it this way. Maybe we can try to do something new. With the rise of like younger professionals entering into the sector, many of them are very frustrated. And I can't really blame them, because they go in here and they're like, what the heck is this? Why are we doing it this way? Why are we using Robert's rules? Why do we, like all these different things. And then they get frustrated because people are like, well, that's just how it's always been done. So I would say the CEO question, the CEO, that like the structure of this sort of central leader at the organization is one thing, but around that are everything else that people
Yes.
need to consider as well, because these are not isolated segments. They all interact with one another.
They're all interconnected, and that's another great area you delve into in the book, which is the board. And one of the best examples I will just share is, I literally had a colleague who ended up just deciding she was not going to serve on boards anymore because she couldn't quite get her head around Robert's rules and therefore felt excluded and kind of awkward when she couldn't, immediately pop in her role with whatever she was supposed to do, Robert rules wise. And I just think that's ridiculous, right? It's silly and it's not required. It's not, there's nowhere, right, in any nonprofit scenario. And to me, that was just a heartbreaker. And it's, of course, one of many, many examples. I don't know if there are other thoughts you have on that part, which again, we could do an entire episode on Robert's rules. But
Yeah, I'm sorry that your friend feels this way, and also she's not alone. I mean, I remember feeling very isolated with Robert's rules and I'm pretty good with English, like, and I'm like, what the heck, like the motioning, the seconding, and all this stuff. Robert's rules is literally 150 years old, right? It was written by this U.S. Army officer named Henry Martin Robert, who took the U.S. Congress parliamentary procedures and wrote them down to a book. So these rules were designed for like a body of like several hundred people, not for like 8 people who are eating hummus, trying to determine like the, like the strategic plan of a small organization here. So I kind of liken Robert's rules and many things in our sector to like Taco Tuesday. It's Taco Tuesday. It's great. It alliterates. It's fine. But you can have something else. You can have spaghetti on Tuesday. You can have tacos on Wednesdays. I don't know. No one's requiring you. It's okay for you to do something else. The IRS is not going to come after you if you decide to abandon Robert's rules. But the Robert's rule is just one example of that. Going back to Sharian's question, which is like, we also, like the structure of leadership right now, that's still Taco Tuesday. No one says there needs to be one CEO or one ED who gets to veto everything that they don't like and who have to make all the important decisions either. Once we let go of that at my own organization, it just freed me up to be so much more effective and happier. Like the work started becoming more joyful instead of being stressful.
We're back to joy.
We're back to joy. I remember like when we started having a new structure, which was it was called the advice process, which was that if you are the person closest to the issue area, then you make the decision. So if you're a development director, then you make the decisions on these galas and whatever. I don't, as the ED, like I can't veto. If you decide that you're the development director, you want to just throw a pajama party for major donors or whatever, right?
Please, can we do that instead of a gala? I'm going to say it here right now.
Right. The only thing I can do, right, because the advice process is you have to check in with people most affected by your decision. And you have to check in with people who have advice that could help you make the best decision. But once you do those two things, then it's your decision to make. And I, the ED, cannot veto your decision. Now, at first, it was really scary to do something like that, right? It changed the power dynamic.
Of control, right?
Yeah. And I am a control freak. I mean, you may not realize this about me, right? But I need everything to be in control. I need things to be, I don't like zip lines because I'm like, I can't control where I'm going. I don't like it.
You wear it well because I did not realize that about you. So I think you do a good job reining that in when you need to.
Thank you. But once I was able to relinquish control, it was amazing because there were so many decisions I did not have to make, and also allow the team to be very invested because it's their decision and no one else can interfere with that. And then allowed them to really do a good job and being very thoughtful. And that really helps with their own leadership and their own sense of meaningfulness for their work. Right. And that freed me.
Right?
Yeah, an agency. And it freed me to go and focus on things that only I can make decisions in because I had my own area of decision making that no one else could really, veto or override. So that sort of the leadership structure needs to go hand in hand with the sort of like decision making and power structure, and also a culture of feedback, which Ananda again was also very good at instilling in our organization. It's like this culture of feedback, and we need to we suck at giving feedback in this sector because we tend to attract nice people who are conflict avoidant, the entire sector. And so
Yep.
we need to do a much better job with being able to give and receive feedback. And that takes tons of training and practice.
The other thing that I love hearing this is it sounds like it was very liberating for you and very liberating for the team, right? To change this up. So I love that idea of that liberation. And again, as you said before, hopefully it not only brought you more joy, but it brought staff, again, they had more agency and joy. I think the one other thing I'll say before we get to your giving away 5 of your books, yay, is that I think another example or an example of what you just talked about of that scenario is how often the fundraiser or fundraisers get told, here's what you have to raise next year. Right? I mean, I feel like that's a lot of, gets back to a lot of what you're talking about around, no, that the expert is the one who should be not only at the table, but helping to drive, right? The idea of, okay, what is it that we're talking about? What are the programs we need? Fine, that we need funding for, et cetera. But to not just be told, here's what you have to raise when you are the expert.
Yeah, we do have this sort of propensity in the sector to kind of hire brilliant professionals and then ignore their expertise. Right? Like, fundraiser is definitely one thing. Yeah, you should absolutely work with the fundraiser to determine like what is the best goal, what is realistic, what is the best strategy for reaching the goals and everything, right? But it's also with programming. It's with HR. It's with finance, whatever. If I'm an HR professional that you hired, and I come in, and I'm like, hey, we really need to do paid family leave for everyone here, okay? And then you're like, nah, I don't really want to do that. It's just how demoralizing. Why did you hire this person?
Mm-hmm.
If they come in, they're like, well, this is what the field is doing, and this is what aligns with our value of equity. And then you, as the ED or the CEO, goes and overrides that when you don't have the same level of expertise. Like, that makes little sense. And I think this is why so many people burn out. Is program directors and operations professionals and so on, evaluation experts come in, and then they get overridden by people who have less experience.
Yeah, at best, it's a dysfunctional environment. At worst, it's a toxic environment, right, that you're creating in that situation. Vu, I continue to be so excited about your book. So anything else before we sign off, Vu, that you want to make sure people hear?
Thanks for having me here. And also thank you to Patrick, the producer, for probably editing everything and getting rid of all of our ums and whatever, and the cussing, which we didn't do too much of today. Thankfully.
Yeah, we were on relatively good behavior. So yes,
pretty good.
Big thank you to Patrick for sure. And with that, I am glad that you came on, and we're glad you asked. Whew, that was such an energizing experience. As ever, Vu speaks truth to power on so many essential topics. Even our discussion before we delved into the 3 questions were illuminating. So, speaking of those questions, the first one, you'll recall, came from Vu. And his question was broad, yet I think very substantial, especially at this moment in time. And it is, what is bringing you joy right now? We covered a lot, including how important it is to put that question into chat during, for example, the icebreaker portion of his webinars, during presentations, during staff meetings, and to also ask folks that question just when you're out and about, right, in the world. Vu said that when he does that, especially when he puts that question in a chat, for you, it could be literally a meeting you're in with other colleagues. So when he does that, what he sees is that folks tend to respond with either small things such as spending time with friends and family, or big issues such as positive health news. Perhaps not surprisingly, all of these answers tend to be personal. By the way, I was so happy, speaking of personal, to be called out by Vu on not bringing my dog Gage into the room. Vu is so right. Bring it on. His point about the importance of being fully human and not worrying about being quote unquote professional really resonated with me. The second question we covered was, what can I do to help make your experience at fill in the blank good/better? Meaning, what can I do to help make your experience at, and in this case, it might be your organization, for example, good and or better. We talked about this in the context of staff, and Vu gave a really nice shout out to Ananda Valenzuela, who, as he puts it, was the one who would ask these types of questions of staff when Vu was executive director. I really appreciated Vu's vulnerability in this moment as he shared that asking these types of questions of staff are not his strong suit. He went on to share that trust building really mattered. Once Ananda showed that she and Vu could be trusted to actually listen and act on staff's concerns, it grew from questions like, hey, we really need a new microwave, to building a safe environment where folks felt comfortable saying, we need to look at our systems, or we need to look at the power dynamics of some of these roles, or we need to look at a different leadership model, or even, can we address our decision-making process, please? The willingness to change has to be a part of the active listening process for Vu. For example, community listening sessions done by funders. What can we do better? Is often the question from funders. Nonprofit leaders, from Vu's perspective, usually respond by saying they need more general operating funds. And then funders most often will say, well, that's not what we'll be doing this year, but thanks so much for your feedback. This was such an aha moment for me about a key component of the active in active listening, being about taking action on what response you get to your question. In other words, I've always been really focused on the active and active listening being about making sure that you are listening deeply to what the other person says in response to your question, and that you are truly hearing and understanding that response. But what Vu taught me in real time was that the other active and active listening must be that if you are going to ask the question, you need to be committed to actually acting on what they say in response, or don't even ask that question in the first place. In our first episode with Nina, we talked about respect, and as far as I'm concerned, that's where that respect comes in. Further, Vu gave us a very important reminder about how folks from marginalized communities wouldn't necessarily be comfortable answering this question because they'd worry about their job. They'd worry about maybe their job even being on the line if they were to give an honest answer. In fact, he said that they may be reticent or even frightened because of past experiences along those lines. Vu shared that the culture and work environment needs to be such that folks feel they can be open and honest in their responses without any fear of retribution. So for the third and last question, Cherry and Koshi submitted for Vu, in your book, you talk about various options for breaking the traditional one-person CEO/ED, executive director, leadership mold. If you were in-house today, which model would you want to be a part of and why? Charian's thorough and thoughtful question provided the opportunity for Vu to talk about staff leadership models, which he covers beautifully in his book, which also led us into a robust discussion about boards, also covered in his book, particularly where Robert's Rules of Order are concerned. Vu shared that the ED position is impossible. Too much pressure leads to leadership burnout. The role can be very lonely and frustrating. Vu lifted up a pivotal section of his book about how the Robert of Robert's Rules, and that's Henry Martin Robert to be exact, turns 150 this year. 150, my friends. So along those lines, we then make a brief foray into one of my favorite active listening neighborhoods, where we make change not for change's sake, but because we've listened to the communities most impacted and are making changes that make sense. His examples, shaking things up by serving tacos on Wednesday versus Tuesday, holding major donor pajama parties instead of galas, were vintage Vu, both hilarious and insightful. Here's my final thought about this interview, about this chat with Vu. His feedback on how we hire people who are too nice in this sector did resonate with me. It brings me back to the famous Brené Brown quote about how clear is kind and unclear is unkind. And the context of that here is that if folks don't have the tough conversations and address the issues we covered, then we will be stuck in an endless loop. What I like about both Vu and Brené's approaches is that they both believe firmly in kindness and compassion, while their definitions of that include courage and frank discussions. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode. I hope you found this conversation as riveting as I did. And here's your chance to get a free copy of Vu Le's book, Reimagining Nonprofits and Philanthropy, Unlocking the Full Potential of a Vital and Complex Sector. All you need to do is head over to the Glad You Ask Patreon page and subscribe. We're building a great community over there, and as a member, you'll get bonus content, including deeper insights into each episode, and more tips about how you can use active listening in your life. Okay, so here's your listener action for this episode. And actually, you have two of them today. One is to submit an engagement question that we may use on a future show. The other is in the context of how moved I was today by our conversation about joy. Please take a moment over the next week or so to ask a colleague this question. What is bringing you joy right now? It's an easy one that I think you'll enjoy hearing the answer to, and I bet that you'll be very glad you asked. Thanks for listening to Glad You Asked, a Hazen Institute for Leadership training podcast. If you enjoy the show, come find me on Patreon for more in-depth content. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. This show is produced by the amazing Patrick and Benjamin Childers of Odd Conduit Media. Please check the show notes for our guest links, today's questions, and more information. A massive heartfelt shout out to my father, Hazen Schumacher, who taught me the power of audio storytelling through his weekly radio show, Jazz Revisited, and to Basil and the Supernaturals, featuring Kevin Thompson and Herbie Hunkley for making original music. If you have a question you'd like me to put out there on our show, send me a message on LinkedIn or send me an email at hello@hazeninc.com. Have you used a question from our show in your life? If so, drop us a line and tell us how it went. You can also learn more about my work at hazeninc.com. Tune in next time to keep exploring active listening on another episode of Glad You Asked.